Today we are talking with David Milne, the author of Worldmaking, the Art and Science of American Diplomacy. Welcome to Redera. We're looking forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you. I'm pleased to be here.
So, fascinating book you've written. It kind of offers an intellectual history of the U.S. foreign policy, I think spanning almost 100 years or more.
That's right.
What brought you to write the book?
So this book connects in some ways to my first book, which was a biography of Walt Rostow. And Rostow was Deputy National Security Advisor under John F. Kennedy. He was chair of the policy planning staff, and he was National Security Advisor outright under Lyndon Johnson. And Rostow, his academic career was an interesting one. He was an economic historian. He was based at MIT through the 1950s, and he became a prominent theorist of modernization, of dispersing more foreign development aid to the developing world in order to modernize those societies and prevent them from turning to communism. But what struck me as interesting about Rostow as I researched the book was his reputation largely stems from his expertise in economic history, and yet he became a fierce advocate of waging war against North Vietnam through the 1960s. And one of the rationales that he presented for bombing North Vietnam stemmed very much from his academic work, his so-called stages of economic growth theory. Now, what Rostow argued in that book, published in 1959, was that all nations pass through 5 stages before reaching their final destination, which is not Marxism-Leninism, as Marx held, of course, but liberal capitalism, the age of high mass consumption. And Rostow believed that all nations have that economic self-interest at heart. It's the prime motivator for action. And so he argued in 1965 to Dean Rusk, Secretary of State at that time, that Ho Chi Minh no longer is a guerrilla fighter with nothing to lose. He has an infrastructure to protect. And so Rostow reasoned if you threaten that infrastructure, it would prove to be highly coercive when it came to North Vietnam. Now, of course, Ho Chi Minh and North Vietnam's leadership at that time weren't nearly as coerced by economic threats and the destruction of its very limited infrastructure because nationalism, Marxism, different types of ideas motivated North Vietnam's actions at that time. So Rostow struck me as interesting as someone who had developed a very coherent, in many ways persuasive theory, but when he applied it to the real world, it didn't work. He was prone, he was partial, he was susceptible to scientism. And so that brought me to this distinction that I draw in Worldmaking between the art and science of US foreign policy. George Kennan, the architect of America's containment doctrine, believed and said at one point, I think it was in 1945, that US foreign policy is an art, not a science. And what Kennan meant by that was that shapers of policy must rely on creativity, intuition, and craft alone. He was very hostile to the notion that the world was some kind of puzzle that had to be unlocked with the application of the appropriate theory. He believed that the world was essentially unknowable in that sense. And he was hostile to the rise of the social sciences in many ways, and particularly their application when it came to US foreign policy making itself. So really the book, the first book, which focuses on Walt Rostow, looks at the 1960s, looks at Rostow's career, and in some ways uses him as a way to interrogate an era. And that's what I've done with Worldmaking, with a very different cast of characters, beginning with Albert Thayer Mahan in the late 19th century and ending right in the present with Barrack Obama.
Very well explained. Thank you. Before the rise of the American economic and obviously leading to naval dominance, was there any even thinking or understanding of what our role is in the world? in a near world, which is within 1,000-mile radius, and then the rest of the world. Was there any kind of understanding? Was there any discussion that you discovered before America marched on the economic development and progress, and that led to the military progress as well?
Of course. So I had a decision to make when I began to think about this book as to when I should begin. And obviously in the very early going, before the revolution, immediately after the US victory in that revolution, foreign policy concerns were paramount and very significant because they impacted so much on the United States as they became in the very early going. So one significant divide that developed in the first few years after independence was declared was a divide or a clash or a disagreement between Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton on the question of whether to lend US support to the French Revolution. Hamilton believed that this was a foolish thing for the infant United States to do, that the United States, in many ways, its future was going to be much more intertwined with maritime prowess, with ensuring that the US maintained cordial relations with Great Britain in spite of the war that they had just waged. Jefferson was much more motivated by ideology, by the fact that France had supported the United States in their war for independence, but also the ideals of the revolution were ones that were very much close to Jefferson's heart. So you have a very early example there of a divide that's often been characterized by scholars of realism. In the case of Hamilton here, focusing very much on US national self-interest, and idealism on the other, being motivated by ideas, by the notion that the United States owes something to the world beyond pursuing its own self-interest. So, I mean, throughout the 19th century, there are many significant foreign policy debates that take place. But I decided to begin in the late 19th century with Albert Thayer Mahan because this was really, as you suggest in your question, when the US surpasses Great Britain to become the world's preeminent economic power. And the 1890s is also interesting for the fact that westward expansion comes to an end. There's a sense among some people in the United States that the US is going to have to pursue a much more expansive or expansionary, much more aggressive, potentially foreign policy, emulating Great Britain in its acquisition for empire. But ideas and debates and great debates about foreign policy have been present in the United States from the very beginning.
You used a very important word, self-interest. Has there ever been a discussion or has the understanding of that term evolved over the last 100 years since you started looking at the first person that you mentioned about Alfred? Because self-interest can mean different things to different people at different times. Was it always self-preservation? Was it always self-domination? Was it always imperialism? Or was it a leading nation? Or was it exceptionalism? Or was it coexistence? What was the self-interest? Or what has been the self-interest in the foreign policy architect mind?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good point. That term has been understood in different ways by different individuals. So to begin then with Albert Thayer Mahan, for Mahan, self-interest primarily, of course, it relates to security. In the first instance, the necessity that the United States is not threatened by competitors. And in this sense, Mahan understood that the US was in a fortuitous position with the Atlantic and the Pacific to the east and to the west, and with Canada and Mexico to the north and the south. So he was conscious, he was attentive to these natural advantages that the United States possessed. But by self-interest, Mahan was focusing, or he was interested primarily in the economic side of that, in the United States becoming a trading nation, in the United States, I guess, discerning that its future prosperity was going to depend on free and, potentially unfettered access to markets further down the line. So his theory or his ideas about naval power as they developed they weren't, or he didn't hope to emulate the British in acquiring a large empire. He thought that was unnecessary for the US to pursue that course, but he did believe that the US needed to acquire bases across the world, coaling stations as they were then, so that the US Navy was able to project its power, project its influence, ensure that the US's natural advantages, its virtues as a manufacturing powerhouse, as an exporting nation, be brought to bear. So Mahan and the self-interest focused very much on the economic side of things. Woodrow Wilson, who I turned to discuss after Mahan in the book, now in some ways he didn't deviate that much from Mahan in viewing economic concerns as vital, as essential. And there's been some fantastic research that's been published recently. One book in particular by Adam Tooze called The Deluge, which really seeks to portray Wilson as someone who's ruthlessly focused on America's economic position and on maximizing its advantages that were present in the aftermath of the First World War. But Wilson also believed, witnessing the terrible primordial bloodletting of the First World War, that the balance of power, this notion that was developed through the 19th century, that particularly by individuals in the United Kingdom, that a balance of power should be maintained by the UK assessing which combination of nations were the strongest, and then perhaps lending some support to the weaker combination in order to ensure stability. A lot of these ideas regarding the balance of power were developed at the Congress of Vienna, and Henry Kissinger has written very admiringly of that generation of individuals who created the so-called Concert for Europe. Now, Wilson believed the balance of power, the idea that this was the key to stability, to peace, was shown to be an illusion by the First World War. And Wilson, in calling for the creation of a League of Nations, in calling for each nation in the world to give up a little bit of its sovereignty in order to, in pursuit of a larger good, which was peace, a peaceable world in which disputes would be arbitrated by a League of Nations. He believed that this was both appropriate for the world, but also that this did serve the US national self-interest, because a peaceable world was one in which the US, as a major trading nation, as the preeminent economy of that time, would thrive. So two very different worldviews presented by Wilson and Mahan in many respects, but in terms of the national self-interest, both believed they were very much acting in accordance with that.
Mm-hmm. So the trade or the growth of trade was the driving factor in deciding what kind of foreign policy we should pursue, because the maritime trade prowess was very necessary for engaging in the international trade between US and Europe at that time. Mm-hmm. Okay, can we continue on that as you were explaining the first two characters, and we want, because there are 9 that I would like, if possible, to cover all 9 of them as we go along, and moving on to the third person who played a key role in the development of foreign policy and how the foreign policy got changed. Were there any economic events or world events that affected between the World War I and the World War II that also led to the change?
Yes, of course. So turning to the third individual that I discuss in my book, and this is Charles Beard, a historian and a political scientist, who is best known in academic circles for a fantastically provocative book called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution of the United States, which caused a great stir when it was published, because Beard asserted, well, the founding fathers, they had many interesting ideas about liberty and ideal political systems and so on, but the principal thing that drove that generation was ensuring that private property, that men of means be protected from mass participatory democracy, and that the Constitution in many ways was framed with that consideration in mind. So Beard, a historian, is probably how most people would recognize or identify Beard. But as I approached the 1920s and 1930s, two very significant decades in the history of US foreign policy, particularly because of the so-called, or the rise of so-called isolationism in this time. This idea presented by many individuals with different motivations in mind, that the US need to retreat from the world, that Mahan and Wilson, in different ways, had both overreached, and that the US, in many ways, it had all these natural advantages. It had a large domestic market. It had many, many great and varied sort of merits. Why bother pursuing an export-led economic strategy? Why was that necessary? And Charles Beard indeed presented in the aftermath of the Wall Street crash, when the Great Depression was really at its height in the 1930s, he called for a policy of continental Americanism, which essentially was a variant on the concept of autarky, or economic self-sufficiency. Beard believed that Mahan and Wilson had erred in believing the United States to be inextricably linked with the rest of the world in its trading patterns and many other aspects too. And Beard's argument was essentially pull up the drawbridge, pursue policies that would lead to self-sufficiency. The US has abundant natural resources. It didn't need to import great quantities of anything in particular to perform well. And the time was right, in the midst of this great economic calamity that was the Great Depression, to forget about the ills afflicting the rest of the world and seek to perfect and to improve the United States itself. So Beard was very much on the left of the political spectrum. His continental Americanism was formulated with a view to reducing unemployment, to guaranteeing rights for workers that weren't yet present, to attending to the blight afflicting America's inner cities. And Beard put together, in some ways, a very kind of appealing, a very articulate vision for a very different type of America. Now, when I thought about this chapter, the 20s and 30s, it seems an odd choice in some ways to focus on Beard. Other individuals, of course, counseled a similar kind of form of retrenchment, although, of course, their motivations were quite different. So I'm thinking here of Charles Lindbergh, Charles Coughlin, the infamous radio priest of Detroit. Their visions were principally chauvinistic ones. Lindbergh, of course, famously believed that the Nazi Party, that Germany was almost destined to dominate Europe, that the US had to reach an accommodation with that nation. It certainly shouldn't confront it. Charles Coughlin was partial to scapegoating minorities within the United States. He was anti-Semitic. There was a narrow, unpleasant racism that undergirded many of those who counseled or who called for America first in this period. But really, Beard, to my mind, provides the most coherent, compelling case for retrenchment, for continental Americanism at that time. And that's why I turn to him in this chapter. And I should add, actually, just while I'm thinking about it, that although Beard was an academic, although he spent a lot of his career at Columbia University, he was a prolific historian. He wrote many books with his wife, Mary Beard, a fantastic historian in her own right. What Beard did in 33 and 34 in writing two books, The Open Door at Home and The Idea of the National Interest, what he hoped to do with these books was to persuade Franklin Delano Roosevelt, newly elected president, someone that Beard vested a great deal of hope in. What Beard hoped he'd do with these books was persuade him of the vision that he was presenting, to persuade him that retrenchment, that continental Americanism was the appropriate path to pursue. And in the context of this book, Beard was the grand strategist who failed. Roosevelt did read the book, or he read, The National Interest, The Idea of the National Interest, and he wrote on the margins many, many critical comments. He made clear indirectly through members of his own cabinet that Beard's vision was not one that FDR believed was tenable. for the US to pursue. So over the course of the 1930s, Beard becomes increasingly frustrated with Roosevelt and his actions, to the degree that he finishes his career writing polemical takedowns of FDR and the machinations that FDR employed in bringing the United States into conflict ultimately with Japan. So there's a sense from 33, 34, there's a hope that Beard might just persuade a president of the efficacy of his vision. When it becomes clear this isn't going to happen, his anger, if you like, his frustration becomes much more pronounced.
Now, in many ways, isn't it natural for any process to oscillate or go through the cycles, that you go in one direction and then you come back, retrench, and then you refocus, regroup, and then regain some strength and progress, and then we move back into the same thing. Hasn't that happened in your experience? Also the same thing, that we kind of vacillate between periodic focus on domestic concerns, or what we call isolationism, and then move back into the world domination or world making. Has that been the experience so far?
I think, there's a lot of truth to what you say there. And I think primarily this relates to large-scale military interventions, and often a sense of disappointment, of loss, of struggling to finesse what it was in the first place that had caused the United States to engage in the world in the manner that it did. So clearly, following U.S. participation in the First World War. Now, it's worth remembering here that the U.S. military contribution to Allied victory in the First World War was very, very significant indeed. The two sides were very, very closely matched through the war, and of course that's what made the war such a brutal one. The trench warfare, the inability of either side really to make decisive inroads in the defences of the other. But the US, when it intervened with a significant reserve of manpower, and of course its economic might was significant. It was the only real kind of irresistible force during the First World War. And so when Wilson came to the Paris Peace Conference to negotiate and to discuss what should happen next with Clemenceau, the French president, and Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, he was disappointed to find that both individuals believed that the greater blood sacrifice made by Britain and France, that they believed that their vision for the peace should be paramount, that Germany should be accorded blame for the conflict, that significant, massive reparations should be extracted, that the peace should be a punitive one. Wilson had called for peace without victory. The Versailles Treaty was of course anything but. And during the 20s and 30s, you have a disappointment at what had transpired there. That Wilson's ideals, that Wilson's grandiose vision, if you like, did not come to pass. And part of the kind of the backlash, the move towards retrenchment, is very much conditioned by that. Now, the Second World War, of course, is very different. The US, from the point of its initial intervention, it's the declaration of war on Japan, Germany declaring war on the United States, the massive mobilization that follows, both in the European theater and the Pacific theater. What happens at the end of that war is very, very different to what happened at the end of the first, in that the attention levels, the engagement, the centrality of American power is maintained. And this was something that Franklin Roosevelt was very skillful at actioning. FDR throughout the 1940s, throughout the war, would constantly refer back to Wilson and what Wilson had did in his era. And he was particularly attentive to the fact that Wilson had not been successful in bringing his political opponents into his deliberations, they had not been really invested in what Wilson was trying to achieve, his Republican opponents. And it was those Republican opponents, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, that ultimately torpedoed the Treaty of Versailles. FDR was much more skillful, much more pragmatic, much more attentive to the domestic political calculus. And so, in terms of the oscillation that you mentioned, this didn't happen. at the end of the Second World War, as we know, partly due to the rise of Soviet power, the fact that the world very soon after the end of the war shifted, or the US perspective shifted from Germany and Japan being the principal enemy to considering the Soviet Union, with good reason in many respects, to be so, to kind of have replaced that enemy. But in terms of the oscillation and future conflicts, clearly at the end of the Vietnam War, the United States entered a period of introspection. Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, their rise to foreign policy prominence was in part a reaction to the overreach of Kennedy and Johnson in escalating the Vietnam War. Kissinger believed that US power, US credibility had to be maintained, but he also believed that withdrawing from Vietnam was absolutely necessary. But similarly, in the aftermath of the Second Iraq War, you've seen, I think, in the United States a sense in which that intervention, the notion that through invading and occupying Iraq, the Middle East in some ways might be transformed, might be rendered liberal democratic, Iraq serving as a beacon that the rest of the nations in the area would follow. Clearly, this has not come to pass, and it's not come to pass in the most spectacular fashion. And you have a sense, I think, on the part of US public opinion, but also on the part of certain political leaders, and President Obama is certainly one of them, that the US needs to be much more careful in how it applies its power in the world, has to be more modest in its understanding of exactly what it is that US military power can achieve. And there's many lessons that I think Obama has drawn from the Second Iraq War, but also the Vietnam War, and also, a great many other Cold War interventions that led to fairly kind of dire consequences, both immediately and further down the line.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. The foreign policy has been, in many ways, very dependent on the economic might. What Britain could pursue 100 years ago couldn't pursue today, and what China pursued 100 years ago could pursue much better today. Of course, these are the changing times. How did you see when you saw all the individuals shaping? Was the U.S. or having this thinking that we can make the world the way we want, or mold the world, rather than having a thinking that all we can do is shape the world? We can't really make it.
Yeah, I think in terms of economics and thinking about what happens near the end of the war, when there is a major conference that's held in New Hampshire, which eventually leads to the creation of the so-called Bretton Woods system. And sort of the principal negotiators on the UK and the US side were John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White. And through this process of negotiation, in which the UK and the US, of course, played the pivotal roles, agreement was made both to create the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The US dollar essentially became the world's reserve currency from that point onwards. Major ambitious steps were taken to ensure that what happened post-1945 would in no way resemble what happened post-1919, the economic volatility that so afflicted Europe, of course, in the case of Germany with hyperinflation, other nations across Europe too, but also, of course, in the United States too, with the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. And so I think what White and Keynes were both aspiring towards there was, a measure of world making. Structures were implemented, were put into place, ambitious structures, which in the case of the World Bank and the IMF, of course, are still very much with us. In the case of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency, that, of course, came to an end with the 1970s and the return to floating exchange rates. But in terms of ambition, in terms of making the world, I think that was the ambition of many then. And also, similarly, in terms of the individuals that I characterize as being possessed of the most significant, the most vaulting of ambitions, Woodrow Wilson, I think, really stands apart in the sense that what he hoped to do with the creation of the League of Nations was to do something that had never been tried before. He was moving beyond historical precedent. He was hoping to unveil new norms about the world's essentially collaborative nature. This absolutely was an exercise in world making, even though it was one that ultimately failed due to some of the problems that Wilson had in finessing the domestic political calculus back home. And then similarly, I think as we come to more recent times with the advent, so I have a chapter devoted to Paul Wolfowitz, and what Wolfowitz hoped to achieve with the invasion, the occupation of Iraq, was hugely ambitious. It was the reshaping of an entire region. It was attempting to do what the United States had done in West Germany and Japan following the Second World War, and that was to help create high-functioning democracies with excellent economic prospects. So when people said to Wolfowitz, how can you expect this to work in Iraq? Wolfowitz would say, well, we have experience of building nations in Japan and Germany, and we succeeded mightily in doing so. Those who say that this can't happen in Iraq are not attentive to the history of this, and perhaps are conditioned by some kind of ethnocentrism that privileges one set of nations ahead of another. So was Wolfowitz engaged in world making? I think absolutely he was. So I think the term is kind of useful in that sense, although not everyone achieved the ambitions that they certainly had. World making refers to a process, not a reality in some ways. All the individuals, to varying degrees, believed that they were engaged in world making, but very few of them, none of them, in fact, were able in some ways to create the worlds exactly as they hoped, or in the way that they hoped them to become reality.
Mm-hmm. For the likes of Wolfowitz, who are primarily driven by destroy first and then rebuild again under the architect of American thinking, and they're obviously always the fallback has been Germany and Japan, but they fail to understand that Germany and Japan were already in some ways great nations before the war began. Otherwise they would not be able to engage into the war with the rest of the world. And to expect that America recreated them or can rebuild those nations is an utter fallacy.
Absolutely, I agree. And this is one of the great problems with Wolfowitz and his vision at that time. I think it was a member of Colin Powell's staff said at one point in reference to Wolfowitz, I dislike utopians. Those, that are possessed of large and utopian visions tend to often do great damage in seeking to implement them, particularly when the analogies cited are as historically questionable, as you suggested there, as the ones that Wolfowitz employed. So in response to a comment from a journalist that I think had quoted Colin Powell in reference to the impossibility of creating a Jeffersonian democracy in the Middle East. That's when Wolfowitz said, well, people talk about Jeffersonian democracy being impossible there, but, as I said, look what happened in Japan and Germany. So there's a story here to be told also about the uses of history and the use of historical analogy and the abuse of historical analogy, as is often the case. I mean, probably the most highly cited or most commonly deployed historical analogy in the Cold War era was that of Munich, that the US must stand firm, must not fall into the trap that Neville Chamberlain did in believing that a negotiation with an implacable enemy was the appropriate course to pursue. And one of the criticisms that was leveled at Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger in this period was that in normalizing or seeking to normalize relations with Moscow, in seeking to pursue a policy of détente, they were really missing the essential character of the Soviet regime, which was deeply problematic, which was an evil empire, right? As Ronald Reagan famously described it. You can't pursue or seek to pursue normalized relations with such a nation. You have to make a moral judgment there, and that was something that Kissinger's critics, and Wolfowitz was one, believed that he was lacking. But yeah, in terms of historical analogies, I mean, there's been a lot of interesting kind of articles and books written on the subject, but it's something that recurs through my own book. This notion of history being applied or misapplied with sometimes calamitous consequences.
Many times the so-called elitists who seems to apply science but are just experimenting and developing as a craft. And I think one thing that we haven't talked about, which I would like to focus, you have done a very good job in giving the overview and putting all these individuals who have shaped foreign affairs and foreign policy for so many decades. Are there certain scientists' approach and there are certain artistic approach that in the end turned out to be right or dramatically wrong that you would like to highlight? That certain scientific approaches, so-called scientific approaches, just never worked, and certain so-called artistic approaches worked or not worked.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
That we can still apply going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think in response to that, it might be useful just to mention very briefly an interesting episode that occurred in 1989, where George Kennan appeared before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. And Kennan was asked by Daniel Patrick Moynihan, then the senator from New York, if he believed the time was right, now that the Soviet Union appeared to be dissolving, that the Cold War, to all intents and purposes, was coming to an end, wasn't the time right now for some form of Wilsonian policy to be pursued by the United States? Now, Moynihan, in asking this question, I think expected Kennan to, choke on his water and say, under no circumstances should Wilsonianism be pursued, meaning giving up sovereignty, vesting faith in an international organization. I think he expected the response to be a skeptical one, but Kennan said, well, yes, actually. There are two instances where Wilsonianism, and, by that he partly meant a scientific approach where Wilsonianism was appropriate to pursue. The first was in reference to nuclear proliferation. He believed that individual nation states pursuing their own interests were, in these circumstances, it was impossible for any type of agreement to be reached, both to, essentially in time to eradicate nuclear weapons, to take them off the face of the earth. And he believed that these weapons, as many do, pose an apocalyptic threat, and that misuse could happen at any time, and that the dangers of that were so profound that the UN essentially had to take the lead there in ensuring that these weapons not exist. The second case study that he developed, or the second thing he mentioned, was climate change. Interestingly, Kennan was in some ways way ahead of the curve on that, talking about this issue in 1989. And again, he said, essentially, climate change is one issue where Wilsonianism, where an international organization must be front and center, because climate change has the potential to affect every nation in the world negatively, obviously in different ways, to different extents, but this, Kennan believed, these were the only circumstances where foreign policy could be approached as a science, where foreign policy could be pursued with a view to unveiling new norms, to transcending historical precedent, to pursuing truly, truly ambitious policies, because in these instances, Kennan believed every nation was vested in resolving such issues. And this kind of essentially meant for Kennan that you had something akin to stable laboratory conditions. Of course, on other issues, he was much more skeptical about the scientific or the social scientific approach to theory testing, to pattern detection. So I think those are two good examples where foreign policy in some ways must be approached with the ambition of science, ultimately. Now, where problems have arisen, well, I guess I've alluded to a couple of them. Firstly, in reference to Wilson, the type of peace that he wanted to achieve during the Paris Peace Conference. Wilson's principal advisor, Edward House, described what Wilson was attempting to do or attempting to achieve as a, quote, scientific peace, which was kind of cure the world of the affliction of war, rather than simply manage its symptoms, if you like. So there's a major curative ambition that's at place there in what Wilson hoped to do with the League of Nations. Now, Wilson miscalculated, clearly. His ambition was set way too high, a mark for that vision to become reality. But given how cataclysmic the First World War was, given the level of bloodshed, the huge fatalities in the millions throughout this conflict, one can sympathize. One can, in fact, in some respects, support what it was that Wilson was attempting to do at that time. I think it's obviously with the benefit of hindsight that Wilson's actions appear to be too far removed from the art of the possible in some ways. So what I do, I guess, in the book, in talking about these two categories, art and science, craft and intuition versus ambition versus pattern detection, theory testing, I try not to come down too hard on one or the other, although I do think when it comes to measures of ambition and when it comes to overreach and when it comes to pursuing policies that are excellent sounding in theory but almost impossible to implement in practice, those that are susceptible to scientism have often led the United States into some seriously difficult, highly problematic and damaging situations. So I suppose the art is trying to establish when to aspire towards the certainties of science in many ways, as Kennan suggested had to happen in nuclear proliferation and climate change, and when to be more careful, when to be more circumspect, when to practice a more pragmatic approach to the world. So it's the art of when to pursue the art or the science.
And that leads to my next question, and that is, and this may come as a very big surprise to you, all these practitioners of foreign policies have focused themselves in some kind of idealism or in some kind of beliefs and so on, right or wrong. History proves that later on. But I think what has never been discussed in the past is that applying this science or applying this art is very much dependent on where the venue or the theater of war has been selected. For example, in the last 20 years, America has been very much focused on the Middle East. And what happens in the process? We have a rise of power in Asia, and of course, notably China, and very soon probably India and other countries as well.
Yep.
Virtually Latin America has been completely forgotten. Virtually no focus on Africa. So what happens is that you may have all the right tools and you may do all the right things, but if you're applying into the wrong venue, the overall outcome is never going to be good. And that has consistently been the case with us.
I absolutely agree. And I think if there's a common theme or a common blind spot that afflicts many of the thinkers that I discuss throughout, it's, I guess, an inability to finesse where power will reside in coming generations, peering into the future to finesse where it is the United States should turn its attention. And George Kennan, for all his merits as a dissenter against US foreign policy, as he was through much of the Cold War, through all his prescience on the issue of climate change and nuclear proliferation, he had a real blind spot when it came to understanding the diffusion of power, if you like, of understanding that nations in Southeast Asia, China, India, turning to Latin America, the rise of Brazil. All of these issues were ones that Kennan failed to anticipate because his vision was often crudely ethnocentric. And so Kennan said at one point, or wrote at one point to Walt Rostow in 1962, he wrote a very kind of strong critique of a paper that Rostow had written calling for greater US engagement with the developing world, largely in reference to foreign aid. Kennan, in reply, this is a fanciful vision, I'm paraphrasing here. Most nations, or all nations that have had success in the world, have their origins on the North Sea. This is how Kennan responded to Rostow in 1962. I mean, could not have been more wrong. Could not have been less able to discern this huge diffusion of economic power, the rise of the Pacific Tiger economies, the rise of China, all of these issues that you raise. So often the perspective that these individuals adopt is crudely Atlanticist, focused very much on US-European relations, and less attentive to power shifts happening elsewhere.
We have been speaking with David Milne, the author of Worldmaking, the Art and Science of American Diplomacy. That was a wonderful discussion we had about the book. Please tell us a little bit more about you and how your professional career was shaped and was made, and where are you heading in the future?
Sure, thanks. Yeah, so I was an undergraduate at the London School of Economics in the mid-1990s. I'm from Scotland originally, from Edinburgh, and my first degree was in history. My ambition when I graduate from the LSE, was not to become a historian, but to become a novelist, in fact. So I took a part-time job, as a full-time job rather, as a copywriter, in the hope that I could combine writing advertising copy with, writing a wonderful novel in my spare time, which didn't really come to pass, I must confess. And so I then went back to university to do a master's and a PhD in history, almost with a view to writing a book. Not necessarily, of course, this is what happened, not necessarily with the principal goal of being or becoming a professional historian. So as I mentioned earlier, my first book was an intellectual biography of Walt Rostow, and that was published in 2008 with the title America's Rasputin, Walt Rostow and the Vietnam War. And then that led me, as I said earlier, to this kind of wider study, this kind of more ambitious, broader intellectual history of US foreign policy, which came out last September, and I've been delighted with the attention it's received. The reviews have been good, and it's been really fun to talk about the book in various venues, including this interview indeed. For the next book, I'm planning a fairly significant change in direction, in that I'm looking to write a biography of a Norwegian American journalist named Sigrid Shultz, who lived in Berlin from 1914 to 1941. And Shultz is fascinating to me for various reasons. She was born in Chicago. Her father was a portrait painter. They emigrated to France and then Germany, so his father could paint some minor royalty in Germany in the latter case. And so Sigrid and her mother were in Berlin during the First World War, very much affected by the food shortages. And then in the aftermath of the conflict, she was hired as a translator by the Chicago Tribune. And her work as a translator brought her into direct contact with General Ludendorff, the prominent German politician and nationalist. She interviewed members of the Spartacist uprising in Berlin. She traveled to Upper Silesia in 1921 to interview ethnic Poles ahead of the plebiscite there. And then through the 20s and 30s, she was at so many different flashpoints, both in Germany and across Central Europe. She came to know Hermann Goering and interviewed him a number of times. Through Goering, she came to interview Adolf Hitler, which she did twice. And she was very prescient on threat that would be posed by Nazism, by the Nazi Party, if it ever came to power, in a way that her fellow journalist, Dorothy Thompson, who famously dismissed Hitler as a clown, someone who could never rise to the pinnacle of German politics. Well, Shultz was a lot more accurate in many ways in her portrayal, in her understanding of Hitler than, well, not just Thompson, but many others indeed. So her reporting became a real thorn in the side of the Nazi authorities through the 1930s, so much so that the Gestapo attempted to frame her for espionage, which they attempted to do in 1935, failed to do so. Shultz later prepared a copy and submitted under the false name of John Dixon in the hope of getting past the Nazi censors. And Shultz was actually injured during a British bombing raid on Berlin in 1941. She was hit by shrapnel in the leg while delivering a radio broadcast, and she returned to the United States. But then Shultz returned following D-Day, was one of the first to enter the Buchenwald camp, and wrote very powerfully on that experience, and then covered the Nuremberg trials later. So it's a remarkable vantage point that Shultz provides on a hugely tumultuous period in German and European history. And her papers are fascinating, are rich, and I've been enjoying reading those papers. And so I suppose where there's a point of continuity, I'm looking at an individual who witnessed remarkable seismic world events. But unlike many of the individuals I discuss in Worldmaking, Shultz is not someone who possesses the power to shape policy, to shape events, or to attempt to shape events in this way. So it's a real kind of change in direction for me, but I'm very much looking forward to really diving into the research and the writing.
Exciting. Please do keep us in mind when you do have the book ready and out in the marketplace.
Okay, I will do. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time and your comment. Fascinating book to read, and even more fascinating to hear you talk about the world making and the individuals that have shaped the American diplomacy over the years and decades.
Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.